In the middle of a high-stakes boardroom confrontation at a powerful technology corporation, when the young CEO found herself cornered by a carefully manufactured marriage scandal designed to strip away her authority, one ordinary man stood up from the back of the room. He was not a lawyer, not a director, not a shareholder, just a single father. But before dozens of suspicious, calculating eyes, he spoke one sentence that silenced the entire room. "She's my wife." Nobody believed him, until the following morning, when that same CEO knelt before him and made an offer no one could have imagined. What would you do if a single lie told to save someone slowly became the most honest thing you ever said? The apartment on Maplewood Drive was the kind of place that looked smaller from the outside than it felt from within, mostly because Caleb Carter had learned, through necessity, the specific art of making space feel like enough. He was 27 years old, and he lived by a quiet and deliberate economy. The furniture was second-hand, but carefully kept. The kitchen smelled of coffee each morning. The walls between rooms were thin enough that he could hear Mia breathing at night from the hallway. And he had decided, some months back, that this was not a shortcoming of the apartment, but one of its more valuable features. She was 6. She had her father's dark eyes and her own peculiar sense of logic. And she held an unshakable conviction that Caleb Carter was the greatest person who had ever lived. He was genuinely uncertain what he'd done to earn this. He suspected it had something to do with his pancakes, and the fact that he never flinched when she asked hard questions. He had been a systems engineer once. Not the ordinary kind, the kind that companies fought over. The kind whose name appeared in internal reports as a reason things worked rather than a reason things fell apart. At Halcyon Digital, he had been a team lead before he was 25, the youngest in his department to receive a performance bonus in consecutive years. He was building something, and everyone around him could see it, and he could feel the shape of a real future assembling itself in front of him. And then, on an autumn Tuesday 3 years ago, it ended. A server cascade failure. 3 hours of total infrastructure downtime. Millions in losses. The kind of disaster that demands a name to carry it, not because the name is accurate, but because organizations function on accountability, even when accountability is fiction. They chose Caleb. The termination came by email. His manager didn't return his calls. He packed a single cardboard box in the building's parking garage while rain moved through the city, drove home, and made Mia grilled cheese for dinner because she was 3 years old. And the most important thing in the world was that she didn't know anything had gone wrong. He'd been freelancing since. Contract IT work, server maintenance, remote network diagnostics for small businesses that couldn't carry a full-time tech team. It kept them fed and housed, and it kept him present for morning drop-offs and 3 o'clock pickups. He had constructed a smaller life, and he accepted most of it. But some mornings he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold, and he stared at nothing in particular, and he thought about the official explanation for what had happened at Halcyon. Not the report, the thing behind the report, the detail that had never added up and that he'd never been able to prove, and that he had eventually decided, for the sake of his own functioning, to stop thinking about. He hadn't entirely stopped. "Daddy," Mia said one evening, sitting beside him at the table with her homework open and ignored in front of her. "Do you want to work in a big building again?" He looked at her. "Why do you ask?" "Because Tyler's dad works in a tower, and Tyler says his dad is important." She considered the problem with the gravity she brought to all important matters. "You're important. You just work at home." "Working at home is good," Caleb said. "I see you more." "I know." She returned to her worksheet, coloring inside the lines with careful concentration. "But I think you should do something big again. You could do it. You're the smartest person I know." He didn't answer. He watched her work precisely, deliberately, not because anyone had told her to, but because she had decided that was the right way, and he felt something press against the inside of his chest that was equal parts love and an old, unresolved grief. He would not have traded this life for any version of the other one. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a door he thought he had closed for good was still standing slightly open. Meanwhile, on the 42nd floor of the Hayes building in the city's financial district, Eleanor Hayes was already in her second meeting of the morning. She had arrived at 7:45, which was late by her standards. The night before had stretched past midnight board documents, quarterly projections, a video conference with overseas investors that required her to maintain professional warmth for 90 minutes while her dinner went cold. She was 28 years old, and the youngest chief executive in the company's history, a fact that people mentioned constantly, and always with the particular tone of surprise she had trained herself not to react to. Hayes Technologies was her inheritance in every sense that counted. Her father had built it. When illness had required him to step back, Eleanor had stepped in not reluctantly, not by default, but with the focused efficiency of someone who had been preparing for exactly this for most of her adult life. She knew the company's structure at every level. She understood its vulnerabilities. She had spent 3 years identifying every weakness she could reach. She had not anticipated Dominic Hale. He was 45, a founding board member with old money and well-maintained grievances. He had been passed over for the CEO position twice, and he possessed the specific patience of someone who had been collecting a debt for a very long time. He smiled in meetings. He sent congratulatory messages when the company posted strong quarters. And he had spent the previous 18 months building a case against Eleanor, slowly and without apparent urgency, the way a man builds something he intends to last. Eleanor sat at the head of the conference table and listened to her legal counsel outline the situation, and beneath the practiced composure she had spent years developing, she felt something cold and certain spreading through her chest. She was going to need a way out of this. She did not know yet that the way out was currently in the elevator on his way to the executive technology floor, carrying a server migration kit and a cable connector. 3 weeks after that quiet evening at the kitchen table, a contract came through a staffing agency Caleb worked with occasionally. A 2-day engagement at Hayes Technologies Executive Infrastructure Support, server migration for the secure network, serving the company's senior leadership operations. The work required a vendor badge and an NDA and proximity to the 38th floor server room, which was adjacent to the executive wing. He dropped Mia at school on Tuesday morning, drove to the tower, badged in at security, and took the elevator up. The prior evening, Mia's school had sent a note. Half-day Wednesday, no aftercare available. His regular backup sitter had sent a message the same night, unavailable due to a family matter. He had arranged with Marcus, the building's floor security officer on the executive level, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s who had been charmed within 20 minutes by a 6-year-old with 2 uneven ponytails to let Mia sit in the break room with a juice box and a tablet while Caleb worked. The arrangement was irregular. Marcus had agreed because Mia had looked at him very seriously and said, "My daddy is very professional, so I will also be professional." Caleb had been working for 2 hours when he ran short on a specific connector. The floor schematic showed a supply closet down the main corridor, past the entrance to the executive boardroom. He walked there, found the connector, and on his way back, passed the glass-walled conference room. He wasn't trying to see inside. He was walking with his head down, focused on the connector in his hand, when the quality of the silence from inside the room reached him, the particular silence of a space where something important and painful is happening. He slowed. He looked through the glass. The room held perhaps 15 people. At one end of the long table sat a woman in a dark blazer, straight-backed, still, with the careful composure of someone absorbing pressure and refusing to fold under it. At the other end stood a man in his mid-40s, silver-haired and precisely dressed, speaking in the unhurried tone of someone who had already decided how the situation would resolve. Every other person in the room was angled slightly away from the woman. No one met her eyes. No one leaned in. She was surrounded and entirely alone at the same time. and the man at the other end was using the distance to devastating effect. Caleb had seen this before. Not in boardrooms, in break rooms, in school corridors, in every environment where power arranges itself at someone's expense, and the people around them choose, one by one, not to intervene. He recognized the geometry of it. He turned and kept walking. He was halfway back to the server room when he stopped. The man at the other end of the table was Dominic Hale, and he had been building toward this morning for longer than most people in the room understood. He was a founding board member, present since the company's earliest days when Richard Hayes had needed capital and credibility. Dominic had provided both, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades cultivating the belief that this entitled him to something more than a seat at the table. When Eleanor had stepped into the CEO role and filled every inch of it with a competence that left no gaps for him to occupy, he had decided to manufacture one. The investigation had taken 3 months. The legal framework, 2 more. The document he had distributed to every board member the previous evening was 14 pages long and meticulously sourced. It cited the original company charter Section 12, subsection C, the domestic stability provision, and presented a detailed record demonstrating that Eleanor Hayes had no registered spouse, no documented domestic partner, and had made no correction to the impression, circulating quietly in financial press over the previous 2 years, that she maintained a committed personal relationship. He called it a crisis of integrity. The phrase appeared in the executive summary. "Miss Hayes," Dominic said. And the choice of Miss rather than any other form of address was as deliberate as everything else he did. The board has a responsibility to its shareholders, and shareholders are owed transparency about the leadership they trust with their investment. Eleanor sat with her hands folded on the table. Her expression gave away nothing. "I've addressed this language before," she said. "The charter provision does not explicitly, it specifies stable domestic leadership," Dominic said. He let the phrase settle in the room. "The board's position is that the current situation does not meet that standard. The board's interpretation," Eleanor said carefully, "is not the same as the charter's language. That distinction will matter in any formal review. Then we will have a formal review." Dominic smiled. "Unless you can provide evidence today that the situation is other than what my report indicates." He slid his copy of the report 2 inches forward on the table. A small, surgical gesture. "I have already won." The room was silent. Eleanor's legal counsel looked at his notepad. The 2 senior vice presidents on either side of her were both very interested in the table's surface. One junior board member shifted in his chair. No one spoke. Dominic let the silence accumulate. Every second, without an answer, was another stone in the structure he was building around her. He was not in a hurry. Silence was the most efficient instrument of pressure he knew. Eleanor breathed. She looked at the document. She looked at Dominic. "I understand what you're doing," she said. "Quiet. Even. Understanding it doesn't make it easier to stop." It was an honest thing to say, and it cost her something, and every person in that room heard the cost. A few of them looked up. Dominic opened his mouth. From outside the conference room, from the doorway, which had been left 3 inches open, a voice arrived before his. "I can answer that question." A beat of silence. "She's my wife." The room turned as one. He had not planned it. That was the detail he would return to later, not with pride, not with regret, but with the bewildered, analytical attention of someone examining an impulse that bypassed his reasoning entirely and arrived already complete. He had been standing in the corridor with a cable connector in his left hand. He had watched, through 3 inches of open door, as a woman he had never spoken to absorbed the concentrated will of a room full of people who had made the collective decision to stop protecting her. And something below the level of deliberate thought, something old and certain, and immune to cost-benefit analysis, had decided this was not something he was willing to continue witnessing. He pushed the door open. He spoke. And now every face in the room had turned toward him. He was in dark jeans and a gray work shirt. A vendor badge was clipped to his front pocket. He was carrying a cable connector. He looked, with complete objectivity, nothing like a person who belonged in this room. He was not imposing. He was not the kind of presence that filled a space. He was lean and quiet, and had the kind of face that most people could look at and forget within the hour, unless they caught his eyes, which held an unsettling stillness, the stillness of someone who was always considering several things simultaneously and had simply chosen not to announce any of them. The room stared at him. Dominic recovered first. "I'm sorry," he said, in the tone of a man who was not sorry at all. "Who are you?" "Caleb Carter." He held eye contact with Dominic. "I'm doing IT work on this floor. I heard what was being discussed." He looked briefly at Eleanor. "I wanted to clarify." Eleanor Hayes had not moved. Her expression was unreadable, not blank, but contained. She was looking at him with something he couldn't immediately name. Not gratitude. Not panic. The focused assessment of someone watching a situation develop outside their control and attempting to determine, with great speed, what category of event this represented. Behind Caleb, through the fire door he'd left propped open with his toolbox, a small face appeared in the glass panel. Mia Carter had been in the break room for 2 hours with a juice box and her tablet, under Marcus's patient watch. She had finished her programs. She had gotten bored. She had heard her father's voice, which she could identify with the precision of a homing instrument through any amount of background sound. She had followed it. She pressed her nose against the glass panel and looked into the conference room with wide, serious eyes. She could not read the situation, but she could see her father standing in the middle of many adults, and she could see the woman at the big table, and she could see that her father had said something important. Mia pressed her palm flat against the glass in a gesture of silent encouragement. Back in the room, Dominic was already moving. "Mr. Carter," he said, with the precise tone of a man disassembling an argument. "Are you claiming?" "I'm not claiming anything," Caleb said. "I'm stating it." His voice was even the voice he used when a server was down and someone was panicking, and panic was the least functional thing in the room. "Eleanor is my wife. We've kept it private by mutual preference. If the board requires verification, I'm available for whatever process that involves." The silence that followed was the most complete silence Caleb had ever produced in any room in his life. Dominic Hale had spent his career on the proposition that composure could always be broken with the right pressure applied to the right place. He had done it before. He had watched capable people unravel under sustained scrutiny. He had not prepared in any projection for a man in a work shirt with a cable connector. But he was not, in the end, someone who lost composure under pressure. "Mr. Carter," Dominic said, folding his hands on the table, "you understand that a claim of this nature, made before 12 board members, carries significant legal and professional weight. I would encourage you to be entirely certain of what you're saying." "I am certain," Caleb said. "Then you won't object to a few questions." "I won't." What followed was 12 minutes of the most methodical, precisely structured interrogation Caleb had experienced outside of a job interview. Dominic did not bluster. He asked clean questions, the kind designed not to produce an immediate contradiction, but to chart the landscape of someone's knowledge and identify the empty spaces within it. Where did they meet? How long ago? The date of the ceremony. Names of witnesses. Current residents. Any shared accounts, shared documentation, any material evidence that could be produced for the board, Caleb answered. He did not rush. He gave each response. The deliberate weight of someone recalling something lived, rather than constructing something functional. He described a meeting at a technology industry conference in the autumn, 2 years prior. He said the relationship had developed quickly and privately, by choice. He named a date for a ceremony, a date he had assembled in the approximately 30 seconds between speaking and sitting down, and delivered it with the calm of someone reading from memory. Across the table, Eleanor Hayes was watching him. She had understood within about 12 seconds what he was doing. She had assessed the situation, the exposure, the trajectory of it, and she had made in the space of 2 breaths a calculation that was cold and rapid and entirely executive in nature. She could have stopped it. She could have stood up and said, "This man is a contractor I encountered this morning, and I have never spoken to him before today." She could have absorbed the immediate and manageable damage and moved forward. She didn't. 314 people worked at this company. They had mortgages and children in school and parents who depended on them. And Dominic Hale, if he succeeded today, would restructure this board within 60 days in ways that would change the fabric of every one of those 314 lives. Eleanor had looked at that arithmetic before she walked into this meeting, and she had not found a version of it where her own immediate discomfort outweighed the outcome for them. So she answered when Dominic turned his questions toward her. She corroborated the conference. She added details that were not incompatible with anything Caleb had said. She was careful and measured and entirely convincing, because she had been in high-pressure situations long enough to know that the most useful thing you can do in them is simply refuse to collapse. By the time Dominic's 12th question was answered, the room had shifted. It was subtle, a shoulder angle, a pen set down, 2 people who had been staring at the table now watching the exchange. The certainty that had been arranged around Dominic at the start of the meeting had developed a fracture. "The board will require formal documentation," Dominic said. His voice had not changed. It was still smooth and controlled, but he was watching Caleb the way a man watches something he hasn't yet found a category for. "Of course," Caleb said. The meeting suspended 48 hours for Eleanor to produce supporting materials. Dominic had not conceded anything, and the clarity of his opening position had not fully collapsed. But it had been interrupted, and interruption, in a room arranged around certainty, is everything. As the room began to clear, Caleb picked up the cable connector from the table's edge and walked toward the door. He did not look back. Behind him, Eleanor sat for a moment longer than everyone else. Her hands were still folded on the table. She was not looking at Dominic. She was not looking at her counsel. She was looking at the door Caleb had just walked through. She found him 20 minutes later near the elevator bank on the 38th floor, which required her to have used the stairwell from the executive level, which he suspected, correctly, she had done deliberately to avoid the cameras on the main elevators. She was standing with her badge in her hand, her arms crossed in a posture that was less defensive than it looked, and for the first time since he had seen her through the glass, she looked like a person rather than a controlled projection of one. The composure was still there. He had a sense it was more or less permanent, but something beneath it was visible now. The way you see a building's structural frame through a wall when you know where to look. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Caleb," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Why did you do that?" He thought about it. He had been asking himself the same question for the past 45 minutes and had not landed on anything elegant. "Because no one else was going to," he said. "And you looked like someone who didn't deserve what was happening to them. You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "But I know what that room was doing. I've been in a version of it." He paused. "Not a boardroom, but the geometry is the same." Eleanor studied him. She had spent years developing the ability to read people quickly and accurately, because understanding what someone wanted and what they feared was, in her experience, more useful than nearly any other cognitive skill in a professional setting. She read Caleb Carter in those 20 seconds and found someone she did not have an immediate category for. He wasn't performing. He wasn't waiting for something to materialize from what he'd done. He had walked into a room and said a thing, and he was still standing here, entirely unimpressed by his own behavior, which was either the mark of someone who didn't understand what he'd done, or someone who had simply decided it was the right thing and had stopped requiring recognition for it. She didn't think he was the first kind. "You understand," she said carefully, "that what you said in that room carries significant consequences for both of us." "I understand that. You lied to the board of a publicly traded company." "I did," he agreed. And you don't seem... She stopped. You seem very calm about that. I'm calm about the fact that you'll be able to do your job, he said. Which means 300 and something people keep their jobs too. That felt more important than the paperwork. Eleanor was quiet. She had been surrounded, for most of her professional life, by people who needed things from her: resources, access, approval, information. She had become expert at identifying the nature of a need before it was articulated, because that knowledge was a form of leverage. She looked at Caleb Carter, and she tried to find the need beneath the surface. She came up empty. He was not calculating. He had walked in with a cable connector and said something he apparently intended to stand by, and now he was standing in a service corridor, waiting to finish his day's work. I don't understand you, she said. That's fine, he said. I just needed to know you were all right before I got back to the migration. She blinked. It was. She would think later. The only time she had been dismissed in a conversation, without feeling diminished by it. I'm fine, she said. Good. He picked up his toolbox. Then I'll finish up. He turned back toward the server room. She stood in the corridor another moment, then moved toward the stairwell. Neither of them said another word. Eleanor Hayes did not do things halfway. It was, depending on who you asked, either her most admirable quality or the one that made her most difficult to be around. She spent the afternoon reviewing legal exposure from the board's 48-hour deadline. She assigned tasks to her legal team and her communications director. She attended the 4 o'clock product review and stayed on message throughout. She annotated a draft press statement and sent it back with 17 edits. At 5:45, she opened a professional records database and typed a name: Caleb Carter, former systems engineer, Halcyon Digital, terminated for cause. She read the file. The official record was clean and internally consistent, and, to anyone who did not know what to look for, entirely convincing. A server cascade failure, a configuration error in a maintenance file, a finding of individual responsibility, termination. Eleanor had spent 18 months before her tenure at Hayes working at a venture firm that had invested in several competing firms across the region. She knew the industry's patterns, and something about this particular file did not fit the pattern she knew. She pulled the original incident report. The configuration error was dated 14 months before the failure. The file in question had been accessed and modified multiple times between Caleb's last documented touch and the day of the cascade, and each modification was attributed to automated system processes, not manual input. The failure itself had originated from an access tier above Caleb's clearance level. She sat with that for a moment. She pulled Halcyon Digital's corporate records from that period. The company had been acquired 18 months after Caleb's termination, at a notably low valuation, by a holding company with connections, on closer examination, to 2 of the 3 senior executives who had signed off on the termination. She made 3 phone calls. 2 went to people in the industry who owed her favors. 1 went to her head of security. By 9 o'clock, she had a picture that was not complete, but had a very clear shape. Caleb Carter had not caused the failure. The failure had been engineered, and Caleb had been designated as the responsible party not because of evidence, but because of availability, a capable individual with no political protection and no reason for leadership to protect him. More specifically, the sabotage had originated from an external intrusion accessed through a third-party vendor, a vendor that, at the time, had been negotiating a contract extension with Halcyon's executive team, a vendor represented in those negotiations by a business development firm whose founding partner had resigned to join a corporate board shortly afterward. Hayes Technologies' corporate board. Eleanor set her coffee down very carefully. She sat in her dark office, monitors lit, and thought about a man in a gray work shirt who had walked into a room where she was losing and had, without hesitation and without any apparent awareness of his own exposure, changed the shape of the situation. A man who had been destroyed 3 years ago by the same mechanism that was currently being used to destroy her. She thought about the 14 months between Caleb's last documented touch on that file and the date of the failure. She thought about the holding company. She thought about the business development firm and the board seat. She thought about Dominic Hale, who had been on Hayes Technologies' board for 11 years, and whose resume listed in the period before his board tenure 18 months as a founding partner of a business development firm that had since been dissolved. The connection was not yet provable, but it was real, and she could feel the shape of it. She had 48 hours. She picked up her phone. Dominic Hale was also working late. He had not anticipated the interruption at the meeting. He was honest with himself about this. He had spent 4 months in preparation, and the presence of an unknown man with a vendor badge had not appeared in any of his projections. It required adjustment, and he disliked adjustments on principle. He had returned to his office after the meeting and spent 2 hours considering what he knew and did not know about Caleb Carter. By 6 o'clock, he had retained a private investigator. By 9, a preliminary profile was on his desk. Caleb Carter, 27, former Halcyon digital engineer, terminated 3 years prior, freelance IT contractor, single parent, 1 child, no marriage record. The investigator had been thorough. He had checked city and county registries, the state database, domestic partnership filings. He had searched for any legal document in which both names appeared in proximity. There was nothing. Dominic read the report twice, folded it, and placed it in the locked drawer of his desk. He felt the particular satisfaction of a man confirming what he already believed, not surprise, but the validation of careful preparation. The question was not whether the marriage was real. He was now confident it was not. The question was, how to use this most effectively. He could move immediately. He could call an emergency board session, present the finding, demand Eleanor's suspension pending a formal review. It was the direct approach. He had used it before. Eleanor had capacity. If he moved too fast, she would find a way to introduce ambiguity and buy herself time. He had seen her do it in smaller contexts, and he respected the ability even as he had every intention of overcoming it. The smarter play was the shareholder meeting. It was scheduled for Thursday afternoon 2 days away. He had already submitted a request to add an executive integrity review to the agenda. If he waited until Thursday and presented his findings in front of the company's full shareholder base, Eleanor's options for narrative control would be severely limited. A private finding could be contested. A public disclosure before 200 shareholders had a different quality entirely. He drafted a supplemental document. He was careful with it. He stated facts, cited the investigator's report, and included a clean legal analysis of the relevant charter section. He did not speculate. He let the arrangement of the facts do the work, which was, in his experience, the most persuasive thing they could do. He sent it to his attorney and his 2 most reliable board allies. Then he returned to the investigator's report and read it again, more slowly. One detail he'd passed over in his first read caught his attention now. Caleb Carter's termination from Halcyon Digital had been classified, in the internal review summary, as settled, not decided. Settled. He picked up the phone. "The Halcyon file," he said when the investigator answered. "I need the complete record. That may take until tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning is fine." He paused. "Be thorough." He hung up and poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and stood at his office window, looking out at the city below. 42 floors of glass between himself and the street. He had worked 30 years to reach rooms like this, rooms with altitude and distance and the particular view that only belonged to people who had made themselves indispensable. He was very confident. He was 90% confident. He told himself the remaining 10% was noise. He drank his scotch and watched the lights. Eleanor called Caleb at 8:15 on Wednesday morning. He was making Mia's lunch when his phone lit up with an unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. Mr. Carter. Her voice was the same as in the corridor, composed. Level. Direct. I need to speak with you. Alone. Today. He looked at the half-assembled sandwich on the counter. About yesterday? Everything right now is about yesterday, she said. He dropped Mia at school, drove to a coffee shop 2 blocks from the Hayes building, and found Eleanor already there in the corner with her laptop and her coffee, and an expression he had not seen on her before. She looked tired. Not physically, the other kind. She turned her laptop toward him. She had been thorough. More thorough, and more fast than he'd expected, though he was revising his expectations of Eleanor Hayes in real time. She walked him through everything she'd found in one night. The Halcyon incident report, the modification timestamps, the Cascade origin point, the holding company, the business development firm, the board connection. She had organized something genuinely complex into something precise and clear, and she had done it in approximately 8 hours, while also managing a company. He sat across from her and listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You think Dominic is directly connected to what happened at Halcyon? He said. I think the evidence has that shape, she said. I don't have confirmation, but I have enough to build a credible case if I have time. She paused. The shareholder meeting is Thursday. If Dominic presents what he has before I can establish the connection publicly, I lose this position. He looked at her. And you, she said, carefully, get named as the individual who made a false statement to the board. I know, he said. She looked at him steadily. I want to give you the option to retract what you said. Today. Before the shareholder meeting. If you state publicly that you acted without my knowledge, and without any prior relationship, which is the truth, the legal exposure falls on me and not on you. I can manage it. You? No, he said. She held the silence. I said what I said, Caleb told her. I'm not going to walk it back because it got complicated. Your daughter. Don't, he said. Quiet. Not sharp. The way you close a door, rather than slam it. Eleanor was very still. She had come to this coffee shop, prepared to do the correct and responsible thing to extract an innocent person from a situation before it worsened. It was logical. It was ethical. She had rehearsed it in the car. She had not prepared for him to refuse. Why? She asked. She was genuinely asking. Caleb thought for a moment not about what to say, but about whether the honest answer was the one that would actually mean something to her. Because what I said yesterday was the first time in 3 years I told a lie, and it felt more true than anything accurate I'd said, he told her. I don't know what to do with that, but I know I'm not taking it back. Eleanor Hayes looked at him across a small coffee shop table, and something inside her, something she would have difficulty naming with any precision, shifted. Neither of them said anything for a while. Outside, the city was doing its usual Wednesday morning things. Inside, 2 people who had been navigating very different kinds of isolation sat with the particular silence of those who have just recognized each other without entirely meaning to. The shareholder meeting began at 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. The room held just over 220 people, major shareholders, institutional representatives, board members, and a small row of credentialed press along the back wall. The quality of attention in the room was high. These were not people who displayed reaction visibly, but everyone present had a sense that something was about to happen that would change the shape of the company they had invested in. They were correct. Dominic Hale presented first, which was by design. He was measured and precise and thoroughly prepared. He moved through the original inquiry, the 14-page report, and then, with the unhurried certainty of a man who believed the conclusion was already written, he presented the supplemental findings. "The board has conducted a thorough investigation," he said, "and I am prepared to present these findings to the full shareholder body." He looked at Eleanor, across the room, with the look of a man who has already decided how a story ends. There is no record of any legally recognized marriage between Miss Hayes and the individual who made a statement at Tuesday's board meeting. The claim made in that meeting was false, and the board's position is that this constitutes a material misrepresentation affecting the confidence of our shareholders. The room shifted. Not loudly, these were not people who made noise when important things happened. But the quiet recalibration of 200 people was perceptible as a physical presence in the air. Dominic set the supplemental document on the podium. "I move for a formal review of executive eligibility," he said. "Pending that review, I request a temporary suspension of CEO authority as outlined in section." "I'd like to speak." The voice came from the back of the room. Caleb Carter was standing up. He was there on a guest credential issued that morning, classified under technical consultant, and he had taken a seat in the back row and sat quietly for 18 minutes, with his hands on his knees, and his attention entirely on Dominic Hale. "That individual has no recognized standing in this proceeding," Dominic said immediately. "He has standing as a material party to the inquiry currently before this body," Eleanor said. She was standing now, too, near the front of the room, and her voice was the voice of someone who has decided, finally and completely, to stop absorbing and start speaking. "Under Section 9 of our meeting governance, he is entitled to 3 minutes. There was a murmur. Dominic looked at the board chair. Margaret Collins was 62 years old and had been navigating corporate governance disputes for 3 decades. She consulted the relevant document. 3 minutes, she said. Caleb walked to the front. He carried no notes. "My name is Caleb Carter," he said. 3 years ago, I was a systems engineer at Halcyon Digital. I was terminated following a server failure that was officially attributed to an error in my work. The attribution was incorrect. He paused not for effect, but because he was being precise, and precision required the right spacing. The failure was caused by an external intrusion through a third-party vendor. The intrusion was not accidental. I know this because I have spent the last 2 days working with Hayes Technologies' security team to reconstruct the access log from that period. The vendor involved in the intrusion was, at the time, negotiating a contract extension with Halcyon's executive team. The vendor was represented in those negotiations by a business development firm. He looked at Dominic. That firm's founding partner joined this board 11 years ago. He placed a single document on the table in front of Margaret Collins. This is a technical summary of the forensic findings. It includes the original access log, an analysis of the intrusion pathway, and a comparison of the firm's corporate records with current board biographies. The complete documentation is available to any party who requests it. He stepped back. Eleanor moved forward. What followed lasted 22 minutes, and it would be referenced in several business publications over the following months as a significant instance of corporate governance being corrected in real time. Eleanor did not perform. She presented. She was not angry. She was comprehensive. She laid out the full architecture of what Dominic had built and what he had used to build it. The Halcyon sabotage, the holding company acquisition, the 11-year board tenure, the dormant charter clause that had never been invoked in the company's history and that had been weaponized now, with specific timing, for reasons the documents before the board made entirely legible. She connected every piece. She left nothing implied that could be stated directly. Dominic Hale sat through all of it without moving. He was, Caleb observed from his seat along the side wall, genuinely composed. It was, probably, the last time today he would have cause to be. Margaret Collins called a procedural recess at 4:14. It lasted 38 minutes. When the room reconvened, she announced that the executive integrity motion had been withdrawn pending full board review of the supplemental technical findings and that a formal inquiry into the circumstances of the Halcyon Digital failure had been initiated. Dominic Hale resigned his board seat the following morning, citing personal reasons. Eleanor walked out of the building at 6:15, got into the back of her car, and looked at her phone. There was a message from a number she had added to her contacts 2 days ago. It said, "You were excellent." She looked at it for a long time. She did not go home. She sat in the back of the car for a while and told the driver to take a different address. It was not something she had planned, but she had been running on planning for as long as she could remember, and planning had gotten her this far, and she was increasingly persuaded that the most important things did not respond well to it. The building on Maplewood Drive was 4 stories, brick, with a buzzer panel that required 3 attempts to get right. She stood in the entryway with her hands in her coat pockets and waited, and when the door opened, it was not Caleb who answered it. It was Mia. She was 6 years old and wearing striped pajamas, and holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear with the casual authority of someone accustomed to carrying important things. She looked up at Eleanor with absolute and uncalculating curiosity. "Hi," Mia said. "Hi," said Eleanor. Mia considered her with the focused attention of a very young person conducting a thorough assessment. "Are you the lady from Daddy's work?" "Sort of," Eleanor said. "Your coat is very nice," Mia said, with the complete sincerity of someone for whom aesthetic judgment was a serious matter. "Are you here to see him?" "I am," Eleanor said. Mia opened the door the rest of the way. Caleb appeared from down the hall a moment later, still in the gray work shirt, holding a dish towel. He stopped when he saw her. They looked at each other across the hallway. Mia, standing between them, glanced left and then right with the concentrated monitoring of a small person who was tracking something important. Whatever she found in those 2 glances appeared to satisfy her. Eleanor stepped inside. She had walked into rooms containing some of the most formidable people in American business. She had presented to investors who controlled more capital than many governments. She had sat across from people who wanted her to fail, and she had refused, repeatedly and efficiently, to do so. This was the hardest thing she had done in years. She reached into the pocket of her coat. She did something then that Eleanor Hayes had not done in front of another person since she was a child, and that she had not planned, and that she did not fully understand until she was already doing it. She knelt, not dramatically, not in the way of rehearsed gestures. She simply went down to the floor of his apartment hallway, so that she was below the eye level of both of them, so that the geometry of the moment was entirely clear. She was not requesting. She was asking. From her coat pocket she produced a small flat box, the kind used for business cards. Inside was a single card she had typed and printed herself at 11 o'clock the previous night. Because she had wanted to find the right words, and she had not trusted herself to say them without having written them first. She held it out to Caleb. He took it. He read it. It said, "Yesterday you lied to save me. Today I am offering you the truth. I would like to find out what we could be, if we were honest from the beginning. If you are willing, I am asking." Below that, in smaller text, "This is a sincere proposal. It carries no conditions. You are under no obligation, but I mean it in full." And below that, in her own handwriting rather than the printed font, "I also think I have been alone for too long. I think perhaps you have too." He read it twice. The dish towel was still in his hand. Mia, who could not read the card but could read her father's face with the fluency of someone who had been studying it her entire life, said, "Daddy." "What does it say?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "It says," he said slowly, "that someone wants to be honest with us." Mia considered this. She looked at Eleanor. She looked at the rabbit in her own hand. She appeared to conduct an internal deliberation of serious depth. "Are you good at being honest?" she asked Eleanor. "I'm working on getting better at it," Eleanor said. Mia thought about this. Then she looked at Caleb with the expression of someone who has reached a conclusion and is prepared to announce it. "Daddy," she said, I think we should keep her. Caleb looked at his daughter. He looked at the card. He looked at Eleanor Hayes, who was kneeling on the floor of his apartment hallway in a very good coat, with her hands open in front of her, watching him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something unguarded and uncertain and entirely real. He had spent 3 years building a small and careful life. He had kept the door in the back of his mind mostly closed, because keeping it mostly closed was how he had kept everything else together. He thought about a server room corridor and a conference room he'd had no reason to enter. He thought about what it had felt like to speak a thing and have it feel true even when it wasn't yet. He thought about the card in his hand, and the woman on the floor of his hallway, and a 6-year-old in striped pajamas who had already voted and was now watching him with the patient confidence of someone who believes the right answer is coming. "Come inside," he said. Eleanor Hayes stood up. Mia immediately took her by the hand, just reached up and took it, without asking, the way children claim things they have decided belong to them, and led her down the hallway toward the living room, explaining in great detail that the rabbit's name was Captain, that he was very brave, and that he would probably like her if she was not too loud. The dish towel fell from Caleb's hand to the floor. He left it there. Some things could wait.